The factory floor was silent when they fired him. Not because anyone cared, but because everyone was afraid of what would happen next. For 30 years, Daniel Carter had walked through those same metal doors before sunrise. He repaired broken machines, solved problems nobody noticed, and kept the factory running when everyone else had already given up. But on that morning, the new executives didn't even look at him. The company manager stood in front of hundreds of workers and said the words that broke years of loyalty in seconds. "Daniel, we're replacing outdated people with modern solutions." The crowd went quiet. Daniel looked around the room. Some workers lowered their eyes. Some looked uncomfortable, because everyone knew the truth. When the machine stopped, Daniel was the man they called. When production lines failed, Daniel was the man they trusted. But when the company started making millions, they forgot his name. The manager adjusted his expensive suit and continued. "You're 62 years old. Technology has changed. We need younger minds." A few executives laughed quietly. Daniel looked at the giant machines behind him. Machines he had repaired hundreds of times. Machines he understood better than anyone. He slowly removed his old work badge. The badge he had worn for 3 decades. Then he placed it on the manager's desk. "I hope your new machines work better than the old ones." The manager smiled. "They will." Daniel nodded. But he didn't argue. He simply walked away. And nobody realized. The man they had just fired was the only reason the factory still worked. Daniel Carter was never the kind of person people noticed. He didn't wear expensive clothes. He didn't sit in meetings. He didn't give speeches. He came to work, fixed problems, and went home. For years, younger employees joked about him. They called him the old machine whisperer. They laughed when he carried his old toolbox. A toolbox filled with scratched-up tools that looked like they belonged in another century. But what they didn't know was that every tool inside had a story. A broken machine from 1998. A production crisis from 2004. A night shift where Daniel stayed awake for 36 hours to prevent layoffs. He remembered every failure, every mistake, every weakness. Because Daniel didn't just repair machines. He understood them. The factory wasn't just metal and wires to him. It was alive. And he knew exactly when something was wrong. 3 weeks after Daniel left, everything started falling apart. At first, nobody worried. The executives believed the old system was finally gone. The new CEO, Richard Hayes, called a meeting. Richard was the type of man who believed money solved every problem. He had expensive watches, a private office, a team of assistants who followed him everywhere. He looked at the factory reports and smiled. "Production will increase by 40% within 6 months." The engineers nodded. The managers applauded. Everyone wanted to impress him. Then the first machine failed. A small problem. A simple sensor issue. The technicians replaced it. Production continued. Nobody mentioned Daniel. Because admitting they needed him would mean admitting they were wrong. But 2 days later, another machine failed. Then another. Then another. Within 1 week, the entire production line slowed down. Millions of dollars were being lost every day. Richard walked through the factory angry. "Why is this happening?" The engineers looked nervous. "We don't know." Richard stared at them. "You don't know?" The same people who promised improvement suddenly had no answers. Then one engineer quietly said something. Something nobody wanted to hear. Daniel used to handle these issues. The room became silent. Richard laughed. "You're telling me we depended on one old mechanic?" Nobody answered. Because the answer was yes. The engineers began searching through old maintenance records. And that's when they found something strange. Daniel had left notes everywhere. Not normal repair notes. Detailed explanations. Warnings. Solutions. He had predicted problems years before they happened. One engineer opened a folder labeled Future System Failures. Inside were hundreds of pages. Diagrams. Calculations. Blueprints. A complete redesign of the factory's core technology. The engineer's face changed. "What is this?" Another engineer looked over his shoulder and froze. "This isn't maintenance." "What is it?" The engineer whispered. "It's an invention." Years earlier, Daniel had noticed something nobody else did. The factory's machines were becoming less efficient. They were overheating, breaking down, wasting energy. Everyone wanted faster production. Nobody cared about the machines themselves. So Daniel started working after hours. Alone. Using old equipment and leftover materials. He built a system that could predict machine failures before they happened. a technology that could detect tiny changes in pressure, temperature, and vibration, a system that could save millions. But when Daniel presented the idea years ago, management laughed. They told him, "You're a mechanic, not an engineer." So Daniel stopped talking. But he kept improving it. Secretly, quietly, for 30 years. The invention was hidden inside the factory, keeping everything alive. And nobody even knew. When Richard Hayes discovered the truth, he demanded Daniel return. But finding him wasn't easy. Daniel was living quietly outside town, repairing old farm equipment, fixing things for neighbors, doing the same thing he had always done, helping people. When the company car arrived at his house, Daniel looked surprised. Richard stepped out. For the first time, the CEO wasn't smiling. "We need you." Daniel looked at him. "Need me for what?" Richard hesitated. "The factory is failing." Daniel looked away. "That sounds like a management problem." Richard became uncomfortable. "We made a mistake." Daniel looked at him. A man who spent 30 years invisible. A man who was suddenly important. What mistake? Richard had no answer. Because the truth hurt. They didn't make one mistake. They made thousands. They ignored him. They dismissed him. They took everything he gave and never gave him respect. Finally, Richard said, "I was wrong." Daniel picked up his toolbox. But he didn't move. "Are you asking me to fix your machines?" Richard nodded. Daniel looked at him. "No." Richard was shocked. "No." Daniel smiled slightly. "I'm asking you to listen this time." When Daniel returned to the factory, everyone watched. The same workers who ignored him before now stood silently. The same executives who walked past him now moved out of his way. Daniel walked to the main control room. He opened his old toolbox and pulled out a small device. The engineers stared. "What is that?" Daniel answered calmly. "My original prototype." Everyone froze. The entire factory depended on something built by the man they fired. The engineers connected it to the system. The screens changed. Warnings appeared. Thousands of hidden problems were revealed. Problems nobody knew existed. Richard looked terrified. "How long has this been running?" Daniel looked at the machines. 30 years. But then, something worse happened. The system detected a major failure. A critical machine was about to explode. Everyone panicked. The engineers tried shutting it down. Nothing worked. The pressure kept rising. Workers started running. Emergency alarms filled the factory. Richard looked at Daniel. "Can you fix it?" Daniel stared at the machine. The same machine he had warned them about years ago. "Yes." But Daniel pointed to the emergency control. The system was designed to work with human judgment. Richard looked confused. "What does that mean?" Daniel replied. "It means the machine never failed." Everyone looked at him. The people did. Daniel walked directly into the danger zone. Workers shouted. They told him to stop. But Daniel knew every sound, every vibration, every movement. He opened the panel, adjusted one connection, then another. The machine shook violently. Everyone held their breath. Then, silence. The machine stabilized. The factory lights returned. Production restarted. Nobody moved, because everyone understood what happened. The man they called outdated had just saved the entire company. The next morning, Richard called a company-wide meeting. Hundreds of workers gathered. Executives stood beside him. But this time, Daniel stood in the center. Richard looked at everyone. "I want to apologize." The factory became silent. "We ignored the person who understood this place better than anyone." He looked at Daniel. "For 30 years, we thought his value was in his job title." He paused. But his value was in his knowledge. Then Richard revealed something nobody expected. The company was giving Daniel full ownership rights over the technology he created. The invention that saved the factory. The invention everyone ignored. The room exploded with applause. Daniel stood quietly. He didn't celebrate loudly. He simply looked at his old work badge. The same badge they once treated like it meant nothing. Months later, the factory changed. Not because of new machines. Not because of new executives. Because they finally understood something. Experience was not weakness. Quiet people were not invisible. And sometimes, the person nobody listens to is the person holding everything together. Daniel continued working. Not because he needed the job, but because he loved creating. Every morning, he walked through those same doors. But now everyone knew his name. And on the wall beside the entrance, there was a new sign, dedicated to the man who saved the factory. Daniel Carter. the engineer they never recognized, the inventor they almost lost, and the worker who proved the most powerful person in the room is often the one everyone overlooks.